Center the supporting piece exactly under the piston rod and open the valve on the pump first. Then slowly open the shut-off valve till the crosshead rests on the supporting piece. For safety reasons, the jack is forced up again till it touches the crosshead. The shut-off valve must be closed for this. In this position, the bearing running surfaces can be inspected. Should it be necessary to remove the bearing shell, the crosshead must be raised by pushing supporting pieces, each of greater length, under it till the longest one can be positioned. The bolts must be lowered to do this. Look it up in the maintenance manual, Group 330, page 5A. Removing and fitting bearing shells is described in the maintenance manual, Group 330, page 5B. Depending on the instructions of the classification surveyor, the bearing is reassembled with the original bearing shell or a new one. Here we'd like to say a few things about assessing crosshead bearings. The crosshead shell bearing on RTA 58, 68, 76 and 84 engines is made of an aluminium tin alloy. Here you can see the structure. First a steel shell back, then the actual bearing metal, an aluminium tin alloy, and finally a very thin layer called overlay. A bearing shell that has been in operation may be fitted again only if this overlay is still in good condition. This bearing shell may be fitted again. But this one here represents a borderline case. Bearing shells in worse condition than this have to be replaced. The crosshead pin must be in good condition, especially if a new bearing shell has to be fitted. Depending on their state, scratched crosshead pins must be reground, chrome plated or replaced. The bearing is assembled in the reverse order. Note the directions in the maintenance manual, Group 330, pages 2C, 2D and 5B. When assembling, use the oil grade specified in the maintenance manual, Group 330, page 5B. With the shut-off valve closed, the crosshead is lifted slightly and the supporting piece removed. First open the valve of the pump, then the shut-off valve slowly, so that the crosshead is lowered. While lowering it, make sure that the bolt threads are not damaged by the bearing covers. As soon as the crosshead is resting on the bearings, the holding brackets for the bearing covers and the connecting rod may be removed. The bolt threads and nut contact surfaces must be coated with Molykote G paste and the bolt nuts tightened up evenly by hand using a spanner. Bolts and nuts must be in contact without clearance. The protrusion is measured with the feeler gauge. Compare the values x1 plus x2 with the value indicated in the maintenance manual, Group 330, page 2C, for your engine type. Note the directions in the maintenance manual, Group 940, page OD, on working with hydraulic pre-tensioning jacks. After venting the jacks, the pressure is first brought up to 450 bar and held constant. Having tightened the nuts, with the feeler gauge, make sure that they are in proper contact. With this preload, the bearing shell must be pressed in so firmly that there is no longer any clearance between the lower part of the bearing and the bearing cover. After making a reference mark on the nuts, the pressure is raised to 600 bar and the nuts are tightened with a Tommy bar till they are in flush contact. Check with the feeler gauge that the nuts are in proper contact before lowering the pressure. Having removed the jacks, the angle through which the two nuts have been tightened is to be assessed by comparison with the marks made previously. The nuts should have been turned by the same amount. If there are big differences, especially with a particular pair of nuts, the tensioning operation must be repeated. Finally, the axial and radial clearances are checked. Note the directions in the maintenance manual, Group 330, page 1. The engine is turned till the piston in question is at top dead center. Check the top dead center mark on the flywheel. The bottom connecting rod bearing bolts are released and tightened in exactly the same way as those on the top connecting rod bearing. Observe strictly all directions in the first part of this film on the loosening and tightening of the connecting rod bearing bolts. Bottom connecting rod bearings with 4 bolts must be loosened and tightened crosswise. This is described in the maintenance manual, Group 330, pages 2 to 2D. The bearing is lowered carefully and evenly onto the bottom of the bed plate. Make sure that the bolts do not damage the crank pin during this operation. Secure the bearing by holding one of the bolts while lowering it so that it cannot tip over. The engine is turned till the crank of the particular cylinder has the angle alpha. The angle alpha for your engine may be found in the maintenance manual, Group 330, page 4A, figure C. To enable the bearing to be inspected, the crosshead must be fixed to its guide paths with these 4 holding pins. Turn the 4 holding pins in their eccentrics till they are up against the guide shoes. Before the crankshaft can be turned out of the bearing, the connecting rod must be held with a chain block in this swung out position. These Allen screws must not be taken out to inspect the bearing. The crankshaft is turned out of the bearing a little. Then the connecting rod is centered with the chain block so that it no longer touches the crank pin radially. The crankshaft is turned further till there is enough room to inspect the bearing. Make sure that the crank does not strike against the bearing lying on the bed plate. Should it be necessary to replace the bearing, you'll find the appropriate directions in the maintenance manual, Group 330, pages 4 and 4A. The bearing is reassembled in the reverse order. The bearing running surfaces are given a generous application of clean engine oil, When turning back, watch that the crank pin goes into the bearing without radial pressure. Now the chain block is removed and the crankshaft is turned a little further. The 4 holding pins are now removed. The chains on them serve to indicate that the holding pins are still inside the engine. To assemble the bearing, the crankshaft is turned to top dead center again. The bearing is to be cleaned and oiled. Make sure that the bolts do not damage the crank pin when the bearing is lifted. Coat the nut contact surface and the threads with Molykote G paste. Before unloading the jacks, check with the feeler gauge that the nuts are in proper contact. All data for tightening may be found in the maintenance manual, Group 013, pages 1 and 2. After fitting all locking devices, the crankshaft is turned to bottom dead center to check the bearing clearance. Verify once more that all locking devices have been fitted, that there are no tools or other foreign objects inside the engine, and in particular that the 4 holding pins have been removed.
In this film, you've been able to follow an inspection of the connecting rod bearings. Now, all the parts have been properly assembled and the engine is once again ready to go into operation. If you have questions about any aspect of this film, or indeed any questions about Sulzer engines, please contact your nearest Sulzer representative. Our worldwide organization is ready and willing to help you. During the next few hours of operation, the temperature of the respective bearings should be checked manually and compared with the neighboring ones.
The work of onboard maintenance begins with planning the program.
Edge covers. Those in the backside here.
This involves checking what kinds of paints should be used to protect the major areas of the ship, such as the superstructure, engine room, cargo holds, decks, and sometimes ballast tanks. It's your job to get the work done, And the job of this video is to show you how to get it right, step by step. First, get ready. Collect the paint from the stores. Some will be single pack, others twin pack, activator and base, which need to be mixed before use. Each kind requires a different level of surface preparation. Make sure you have all the tools ready to do the job, such as chipping hammer, wire brush, needle gun, disc sander, and grit blaster for preparation, brushes, paint rollers, and sprays for application, and sufficient equipment cleaner to keep the tools in good condition. Make sure you can reach the places where the work is to be done, and that warning notices and barriers are in place. Take all the necessary personal protection measures. Always wear the correct kit: mask, overalls, boots, goggles, gloves. Grit blasting demands extra protective clothing. Now you're ready to get to work, but what's the best way to go about it? There are a number of steps you must follow. Scrape, degrease, wash, prepare the surface and feather, remove dust and debris, avoid surface moisture, apply the coating, check thickness. Be aware that the weather, in particular the temperature, can affect the way the paint behaves. So check application, touch and hard dry times, overcoating time, if necessary. And in the case of two-pack paints, the working time or pot life, as it's sometimes known. Finally, check which equipment cleaner to use. Step 1. Scrape. Using a scraper or chipping hammer, remove any loose paint and scale until you get a firm edge. Work with light strokes. Step 2. Remove grease, oil and soot, paying special attention to areas near machinery. First, mix the correct amount of approved cleaning agent, one which is friendly to the environment, with fresh water. Then work it in with the oil deposit to form a solution which you can remove from the surface. Make sure you don't just spread it out, because if it isn't all removed, the new paint will not stick properly to the surface, and problems will show up later. Step 3. Using plenty of fresh water, wash down the whole of the area to be painted. If any salt remains, it will later cause the paint to detach from the surface. 95% of paint detachment is caused by the presence of salt, moisture or grease. So make certain you keep washing with plenty of fresh water until all traces of salt, grime and dissolved oil are removed. Step 4. Prepare the surface. The purpose is to remove every spot of corrosion and produce the kind of surface onto which the paint can grip. Take care not to polish the surface. These are typical standards and how to achieve them. Unless you prepare thoroughly, problems such as rust rash will appear after painting. The disc sander or power wire brush will both remove corrosion and create a suitable surface by means of feathering. The old paint may be several layers deep. By sanding away the edge to a distance of about 50 millimeters, you create an overlap area, so the paint will stick evenly to the surface. Generally, use light strokes to prevent the disc biting into the steel surface. Wire brush or power wire brush can be used to take off loose corrosion from small areas. For difficult corners, uneven surfaces and angles, a needle gun can be used. Hold it firmly, but do not allow it to dig into the metal. Otherwise, tiny points of steel will later stick up through the coating, leading to new corrosion. The quickest and most effective way of preparing a surface is to grit blast. It exposes large areas of bare steel onto which paint gets a lasting grip. Blasting needs skill, teamwork and training, and you must follow special safety rules. Step 5. Remove all the waste, debris, dirt and dust. Some specks may be so small you cannot see them. But left on the surface, they can cause paint to detach. So brush the same surface several times, or use a vacuum cleaner where you can. Make sure that the waste is correctly disposed of and cannot blow back onto wet paint at a later stage. Step 6. Avoid moisture. Clearly, you should not paint over drops of rain or salt water. But a surface that looks dry may be covered with small droplets. These can form when the temperature of the steel is within 3 degrees of what is called the dew point. This can be measured by using simple equipment. Painting over this moisture can cause large areas of paint to flake off. To ensure the area to be painted is dry, calculate the dew point. Then measure the temperature of the surface. Step 7. Now the time has come for application of the paint. Before you begin painting, check again that you have the right primers and finishes. A result of applying the wrong one over the other could be wrinkling. Before opening the cans, clean them to prevent dust falling in the paint. When paint is left standing, the lighter parts may float to the top. The heavier stay at the bottom. So always stir it up well, using a machine or hand paddle. When using 2-pack products, to avoid waste, only mix the quantity you need for the job. Stir the base first. Add the curing agent. And mix them both together. Now choose the tools for the job in hand. The paint brush is best for small areas or places which cannot be covered or reached by spray. Paint rollers make a thin and uneven coat, so you'll need several coats. For large areas, the spray is the most efficient method, but take care to have the correct air pressure and size of tip. Maintain a steady pace and keep the nozzle always at the same distance from the surface for evenness and to avoid sagging. Always remember to release the spray gun trigger at the end of every pass. Step 8. To ensure you get the correct dry film thickness, measure the thickness of the wet film using the special gauge on a flat surface. Make sure it is the correct depth. Remember, the purpose of the paint is to put a layer of protection around the ship. If the paint is applied too thinly, corrosion will occur. Now you've covered all the steps of getting it right. Scraped, degreased, washed and prepared the surface, removed dust and debris, avoided surface moisture, applied the paint, and checked the film thickness. Having considered the weather conditions, in particular the temperature, you should now check the drying time and the overcoating interval, if necessary, of the paint. Then to get it right, second coat, follow the last 4 steps each time. Of course, you must always clean your equipment so that it's ready for use next time you need it. As a final precaution, you could check the dry film thickness. The end result is a well-protected, good-looking ship. And for you, the satisfaction of getting it right.